Option B, biochemistry. So biochemistry is really where biology and chemistry come together. And so what the topic is really going to focus on is looking at a lot of the major biological molecules that you've heard about before, whether from biology class or from everyday life, things like proteins, DNA, carbohydrates, lipids, but actually looking at their chemical structures. And so thinking about how the structures, the intermolecular forces, and the types of chemical reactions that they undergo actually explain some of their properties and some of the biological processes that they help make happen. So topic or subtopic B1, the intro to biochemistry, is pretty simple. It's new from the old syllabus, and it really just kind of gives you some general concepts to keep with you as you go forward in the biology unit or the biochemistry unit. So this video is mainly going to have a lot of vocab to be aware of and to be able to use, but all in all, it's fairly straightforward. So metabolism is a term that will get used, and you've probably heard before. Metabolism is this sort of catch-all phrase that means the sum of all the different chemical reactions that are occurring inside a living organism at any given time. So inside of you or me or really any organism, there are going to be thousands and thousands of chemical reactions all taking place in a very controlled way at any given time. A metabolic pathway is a sequence or cycle of reactions that get you from a point A to a point B. So sort of like when we looked at reaction mechanisms, where you start with reactants and it makes an intermediate, then the intermediate gets used up, and then you could make another intermediate, and eventually you make it to a product. And if you add all of those steps together, you would eventually get to the net chemical equation, or the net chemical reaction. So metabolic pathways are like that, only they involve many, many more steps, and each step is generally controlled by an enzyme. An enzyme is a protein that acts as a specific biological catalyst that's highly specific for one step of the metabolic pathway. So these are, sequences of reactions that could be, as many as 50 reactions long to get from a point A to a point B, and each step is controlled by an enzyme. Metabolites are compounds or species that take part in the metabolic pathway. So those could be the intermediates, for example, or they could be the initial reactants. But the metabolic pathway just means is a biological term for a sequence of reactions that are controlled by enzymes to get you from a point A to a point B. Biomolecules are just molecules present in living things. It's sort of a catch-all phrase. The function of biomolecules is going to be really closely related to their structure and their shape, and we'll see that as we go through each of the subtopics. Macromolecules is a term that we use to describe really, really large molecules. And so in the biochemistry topic, we're talking about things like proteins and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, polysaccharides, things that have molar masses in the thousands of grams per mole. So these are gigantic molecules, tremendous complexity, and often they are polymers, meaning that they are made from many repeating units. And so even though they're giant, it's going to be possible for us to sort of look at them in sections or to consider them at different levels of their structure, which will sort of simplify the process. A couple other important topics in terms of the changes that are going to take place. So anabolic versus catabolic. So anabolic processes, or anabolism, are processes in the body that involve the synthesis of larger molecules from smaller molecules. So this is a catch-all phrase that's going to be used when we talk about building proteins, putting together nucleic acid molecules, building polysaccharides from sugars, things like that. So anytime your body is building up something, we call it anabolic or anabolism. We'll look at it a little bit more specifically in a moment. Catabolic is the reverse. So catabolic processes are the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller ones. I remember this one by catabolic reminds me somehow of cannibal. Like the word catabol looks a lot like cannibal. I think of cannibal breaking down. Well, we know what cannibals would break down. But anyways, that's how I remember it. I also remember that anabolic, I associate that word with anabolic steroids, which I associate with people getting bigger and stronger. And so anabolic is a buildup and catabolic is a breakdown. The two chemical reactions to know, so like in organic chemistry, you learn tons of different reactions by name. You only have to know two in the biochemistry topic, and these two are largely responsible for the changes that you need to know. So condensation, you've learned before. We learned it also as being called esterification. you take two molecules and link them together, bond them together, and in the process, you remove one water molecule. One water molecule gets removed for every bond that gets formed. Hydrolysis is the reverse. If you break down that word, it means cutting with water. And so this is what happens during catabolic processes. Molecules get split, and for every bond that gets split apart, one water molecule gets added back across the two different molecules. So overall, you can think of this as like a cycle. There's always these cycles taking place inside of your body that small molecules get converted to large molecules, often in the form of polymers, and that's called anabolism or anabolic processes, anabolic reactions. The specific type of chemical reaction is a condensation reaction. In order to make small molecules into large molecules, that's going to require an input of energy. So you can think of those reactions as being endothermic or delta G positive, that they're not spontaneous, that wouldn't happen naturally. So that's why part of the reason why you need to consume energy, you need to consume nutrients, is so you can break them down, get energy to build up these larger molecules. And in the process, for every bond that's formed, one water molecule gets removed. Now, on the other hand, you have lots of large molecules that you consume. You're also made of lots of large molecules, and those large molecules get broken down for a variety of reasons, and that's called catabolism or catabolic process, and the specific reaction is hydrolysis. In order for that to happen, one water molecule needs to be added per bond broken, and as these large molecules get broken down, energy gets released. So you can think of it also as like the energy that gets released from breakdown processes can be the same energy that gets used to supply the energy for these build-up reactions, right? And the water that gets removed here could possibly be the water that gets used there. So it's all these different cycles. They're not exact reverses of each other. So you use different enzymes to build up your molecules and different enzymes to break down your molecules. But net, you get this cycle happening inside of you where you will digest food to get energy so that you can get small molecules, and also so that you can get energy to then build them into specific large molecules. And then when necessary, those large molecules get broken down and the cycle continues. So looking at anabolism or anabolic processes a little bit more closely, a couple more vocab terms. We already described what an anabolic process is. Precursors will be a term that gets applied to the smaller building block molecules. They are precursors for the larger molecules. Biopolymers or condensation polymers are these really giant macromolecules that get built from many repeating smaller unit molecules. Specifically, there's going to be three real biopolymers to know about for biochemistry. There's going to be proteins. Proteins are made from amino acids, many amino acids being linked together. Polysaccharides, which includes starch, but also includes glycogen, are polymers that are made from sugars. So monosaccharides is the biology term for simple sugars. And nucleic acids, which includes DNA and RNA, are built from what we call nucleotides. And a nucleotide in itself is made of three components: a base, a sugar ring, and a phosphate group. So the biopolymers are built from specific monomers that get linked end to end. In order to do that, each monomer must contain two functional groups that can undergo condensation. So condensation, again, is that reaction where we remove water and form bonds. So as an example, here's an amino acid. This is the generic structure of an amino acid. It's called an amino acid because it has an amino functional group, and it has a carboxyl or a carboxylic acid functional group. And we're going to look at these a lot more closely when we talk about proteins. But the amino group and the carboxyl group can condense with one another because we have an OH here, which forms part of the water, and then we have an H from here that will form the other part of the water. So as an example, down here, when two amino acids get together, amino acid 1, amino acid 2, that OH and one of the H's, doesn't really matter which, from the amine, are going to be removed, and here's the water that's been pulled off. And now, in their place, you can see where this bond was. Now we have this link between the two. So we have the remainder of the carboxyl group, we have the remainder of the amino group, and now we formed this new covalent bond. So for one covalent bond formed, we release one water as a byproduct. And now you have two amino acids linked is called a dipeptide. That's the first step in forming a protein. So all these anabolic processes are going to be similar to that, not exactly the same. We'll use different starting materials, but the idea is you've got these very special monomers for each type of biopolymer that have two functional groups on them that can condense, so that when they condense together, I still have this carboxyl group on the end now, and I still have this amino group on the end, so that now these two ends can still link up to further amino acids, and that's how we can make long chains. Those are some examples that we'll look at more closely. And overall, if you think about it, you are going from small molecules to these very complex large molecules. And so that's a process of going from a lot less order to much more order. And so a lot less entropy really means it's going to be non-spontaneous to do this. We know that proteins and DNA and things, they don't just form on their own. You need to have very specific enzymes and things that make these processes happen. And so they require an input of energy for them to happen. So complex biomolecules will contain a great deal of stored energy, but it's very energy intensive to build them. You have to put energy in to make this happen. And so that means that living things need to obtain energy from their surroundings. It's also a way, you can think of it as how we store energy. So like complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, but also lipids, these big molecules that are complex, when we need them, if we aren't able to obtain new nutrients, we can break down our large biomolecules because they store a lot of potential energy. And so we can obtain energy from our large biomolecules by breaking them down. The way we break them down are these catabolic processes. So following up on what we just said, when you do catabolism, you go from more ordered big molecules to these less ordered small molecules, and that's going to be much more disorder, and that's going to be spontaneous. So these processes release energy to the surroundings, usually as heat. And so the complex biomolecules contain the stored energy, and we can release that energy for lots of functions, either just to power us through our day, or for that energy to be used to build other molecules, or for that energy to keep us warm. So there's lots of reasons why we break down molecules. We already talked about the hydrolysis reaction and digestion. You can essentially think of digestion as a series of hydrolysis reactions. There's more going on than just that, but one major aspect of it is it's lots of hydrolysis reactions which break down the big molecules that we have stored up into small component molecules and energy. Lastly, in the intro to biochemistry, you look at two major processes, photosynthesis and respiration. In biology class, you would learn about lots of different enzymes and steps along these metabolic pathways. We are going to greatly simplify it. Photosynthesis, as most of you know, is when plants, usually green plants, are able to synthesize glucose. Okay, so they simplify a monosaccharide, a simple sugar. They also make oxygen in the process as a waste product, which is useful for us. But the key really is that they make glucose from carbon dioxide and water, and they do this through the absorption of light energy. So that's why it's called photo, and synthesis means building. So you're building stuff thanks to the light that you're getting from the sun. This process of photosynthesis is really directly or indirectly responsible for all life on Earth. It's incredibly complex, and so all we are going to look at is the net change. And the net change is that 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters, through many enzyme-controlled steps, will produce a glucose molecule and 6 oxygens. Now, it's a pretty incredible thing that they do. First of all, the plants figured out how to absorb this light energy. But also, it's very non-spontaneous. They're going from these very low energy end product, what we normally consider to be end products of combustion, and they figured out a way to put them together into this much more higher potential energy form known as glucose. So it's going from a low potential energy to high potential energy, and the carbon is going from being highly oxidized in the form of carbon dioxide to being reduced. And in the process, the plants actually split apart water, which we normally only can really do by electrolysis. So it's a pretty incredible thing that evolved to happen, but you're taking carbon and you're making it much more reduced, which makes it much higher in potential energy. And the net result is that you have glucose, this high energy form, this high energy nutrient that everything else is going to use. Chlorophyll is the pigment that is the green photosynthetic pigment that's responsible for trapping the light energy from the sun, and you probably have all heard of that before. Okay, respiration is the reverse. Now, it's not the exact reverse. Again, it's like before when we talked about it being a cycle. Respiration is controlled. It's equally complex, but controlled by totally different enzymes, and the exact reaction steps are totally different than those in photosynthesis. But the net reaction is reverse from photosynthesis. So this is the controlled release of energy inside of cells from these energy-rich molecules, specifically glucose. It's not breathing. That's a different kind of respiration. So this is cellular respiration. And plant cells also undergo respiration, just to clear that up. This glucose that plants make, plants then use that and break it down to get energy to use for different things. So plants both create their own food and then can use that food. Whereas as animals, we just need to eat plants or other animals, and then we can do respiration inside of our cells. There's two main stages to be aware of. The first stage is called glycolysis, and it occurs anaerobically. Anaerobic is a term that means without oxygen. And it produces a very small amount of energy. It really, you can think of it as sort of the equivalent of incomplete combustion. It only partially oxidizes the carbon that's in the glucose. Without any oxygen, there are some further steps of anaerobic respiration that can keep animals alive or cells alive for a little while, or can keep muscle cells going for a little while. So there is the possibility to sort of maintain life with just glycolysis without oxygen. Usually that produces byproducts like lactic acid you've probably heard of for your muscles, or ethanol in the case of yeast. It is enough to keep some animals alive for some time. But for us, if we really want to get a lot of energy from our glucose and completely oxidize it, then we need oxygen, and we do aerobic respiration. Again, we're not going to look at any of the little steps, but the key is if you can fully oxidize the glucose into carbon dioxide and water, then you're going to get the maximum amount of energy from it. And so the net equation actually is exactly the same as combustion, which is pretty amazing. However, it's much more complicated, and it's a series of many redox reactions instead of just one very fast redox reaction when you burn something. But you can get out the same net amount of energy when you consume glucose as when you burn it. It is the same net reaction. Cytochromes, like we talked about, chlorophyll as being a pigment molecule that's essential for photosynthesis. Cytochromes are pigment molecules, which we'll look at again for the HL class, which are important in the oxidation and reduction steps of our food during respiration. Oxygen is the very last or terminal electron acceptor in the process of respiration. And as it gains electrons, it ends up binding to hydrogen and it gets reduced to water. So that's like the last step of respiration. So you have glucose. The glucose is getting oxidized in the process of respiration, eventually turning into carbon dioxide, and the oxygen is getting the hydrogen from the glucose and turning into water. So you're going from high potential energy in glucose to low potential energy products, reduced carbon to oxidized carbon. And so again, it is the net overall, it is essentially the opposite of photosynthesis. And you can think of them in a cycle that you've got glucose and you've got oxygen. These are the high potential energy forms. In respiration, we're going to break them down, oxidize the carbon, and release the potential energy as heat. And that energy can be used to synthesize molecules. It can be used to keep us warm. It can be used for us to move around, all these different life processes. Now we've got these low energy carbon dioxide and water molecules, which plants, if they get energy from the sun, can synthesize together, reduce that carbon, and build the carbon dioxide or the glucose and the oxygen. And so this cycle, photosynthesis and respiration, really it keeps on its own could keep the carbon levels on our planet stable. However, humans have started doing a lot of activities that make a lot more carbon dioxide and water, mainly combusting fossil fuels, burning forests, things like that, which has sort of thrown this cycle out of balance. And so there's now these products are at much higher levels than were previously. Whereas if you took away those activities like burning fossil fuels and deforestation, things like that, then this would actually maintain the amount of carbon on the planet fairly consistent, and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere fairly consistent. So there's topic B1, Introduction to Biochemistry. We talked about biological molecules have diverse functions based on structures and shapes. These metabolic reactions are highly controlled, and we've got catabolism and anabolism. Biopolymers form through condensation reactions and are broken down by hydrolysis reactions. Photosynthesis is the synthesis of energy-rich molecules from carbon dioxide and water using light energy, and respiration is a complex set of metabolic processes providing energy for cells. Difference between condensation and hydrolysis, and the summary equations for photosynthesis and respiration to explain potential balancing of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So just again, this keeps the net amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the atmosphere balanced, but human activities recently especially have caused an imbalance in this cycle where this part of the low energy forms have built up much higher due to burning of fossil fuels and deforestation specifically. Okay, that's your introduction to biochemistry.